It's time now for Movie Spotlight, our Friday feature where we discuss Korean cinema and review some of the latest cinematic releases at the Korean box office and online. Making up our critical panel this week, first we have Darcy Paquet to my left. Darcy, hello, it's good to see you.
Hi, good to be here.
And Jason is taking a break this week, so we have the equally brilliant, if not more brilliant, Marc Raymond with us as well. Marc, hello, it's good to see you too. Yes, hello. Okay, we've had a few weeks where it was all Korean films, but today we have two international releases to talk about. The first is a major Hollywood release. It's called Babylon. It has the same title in Korean. It's directed by Damien Chazelle of La La Land fame. And when I say it is a major release, I say that because of not only the star names involved, but also the epic runtime of 3 hours and 10 minutes. It's set in Hollywood in the 1920s and 30s. Darcy, can you set this one up for us?
Yes, it's very different from La La Land. You can find perhaps a few continuities there, but he seems to have been trying to create kind of a big, scandalous extravaganza that would kind of, shock and provoke its audience on the one hand, and then at the same time showing them a new side of Hollywood film history. So it's revisiting the whole process and industry of filmmaking in the 20s and 30s. And the story focuses on several different characters. They start kind of in different places in their career at the beginning of the film. Some are at the top already, others are at the bottom and trying to work their way up. But they all get caught off, particularly in Hollywood's shift from making sound movies or from making silent movies to sound movies. In that sense, it has a parallel with Singing in the Rain as well, the Hollywood classic.
Sure, and many films like The Artist as well.
Yes,
and all sorts of films, yeah.
So Brad Pitt plays one of the industry's most marketable male stars. Margot Robbie is in it, playing an unknown kind of bombshell actress who's subsequently discovered. There's a newcomer, Diego Calva, who plays a Mexican immigrant who works as a fixer and then later gets involved in filmmaking. Giovanna Adepo plays a jazz musician who plays trumpet both on and off the camera. And then Lee Jun Lee plays a singer-performer artist whose image seems modeled after the legendary actress Anna May Wong. So all of these characters have their fair share of kind of adventures and things. Lots of things happen.
Okay, so...
we don't have 2 hours to describe the plots.
Right. Okay, so Marc, Hollywood has always enjoyed making movies about Hollywood, and this is the latest addition to this long tradition. Inevitably, when you make a film about the film industry, you end up communicating some sort of a message about cinema or the act of filmmaking. And what does Babylon seem to be saying about Hollywood?
It seems very contradictory, and it seems like Darcy mentioned La La Land, which is Chazelle's film, and this seems a film from 5 years ago, which he won the Oscar for Best Director, and this movie almost feels like he's embarrassed by that movie, or at least embarrassed by how celebratory that movie seems to be, or that it has this, and he's like, okay, I want to make this dark version of Hollywood, and to kind of counteract that, and so there still is like a love of filmmaking in there. There's I think the best sequence in the film is like when they're making movies on like the sets. I think that's the best part of the movie. It's a very, as you mentioned, it's 3 hours, so that doesn't take up that much of the time. But and I think the movie's strongest in its first half. I think its last half doesn't work very well because it's about, again, the downfall. It's a very familiar rise and fall kind of structure. But the problem is the movie is a bit cartoonish, I found, and therefore the emotions don't really land the way he wants them to down the stretch. Chazelle's too talented a filmmaker to make a 3-hour movie with nothing good in it, and there is good things in it. But it doesn't work very well as a film. I mean, the reviews haven't been very good. There are people claiming it, like there's always a small minority who says, no, it actually is a masterpiece. But for the most part, it's been, it hasn't gotten great reviews. And I think it's because it just isn't, again, in trying to make this, anti-La La Land, this is just as over the top and just as kind of unconvincing. This is a fantasy too. It's just a dark fantasy of, Hollywood. Right? Almost like modeled on like a 20s silent movie about like a decadent society, like an old biblical like the Babylon title suggests, right?
Sure.
There's that. So it still doesn't feel very like anything like reality. And he also the obsession with singing in the rain comes in again at the end of the movie.
Again.
It's interesting. Like there's some interesting stuff in it, but it just it doesn't hold together, especially in its final half, I found.
Okay, so you're not in the camp that thinks it's a masterpiece as such. Contradictory and cartoonish is how Marc described it to Darcy. You also said the director's goal, it seemed to be to try and shock the audience. Were you shocked at all? And if so, was it a good or bad shocked?
I mean, no, I wasn't really shocked. I'm not usually shocked in movies. I have kind of a calm demeanor, but I don't generally get shocked in movies. But, in this one, certainly if you're the kind of person who doesn't like a lot of bodily fluid and, kind of like coarse sexuality and, wild orgies and everything else. I mean, there's a lot in this film that might kind of offend people. Personally, I didn't really have any problem with a lot of that, but it is true that, I think that Marc gets at it when he says the emotions don't really kind of hit strongly, and that goes both for kind of the general emotional arc of the film, but also kind of these moments. Partly because, they're kind of beautifully shot at the same time they're meant to be shocking, and so you kind of stand back and admire them visually as well. My experience of watching the film basically was there were moments of it that were really kind of engaging and entertaining and that pulled me in, and I was impressed by the filmmaking on a lot of occasions, and there are many moments when it kind of feels like a musical, and so these big wild scenes where everybody's running around and then everything's kind of perfectly choreographed, it feels like a dance sequence, even if it's not one in a literal sense. But on the other hand, I never really could take the film seriously, and I ultimately never was very, very shocked. And so in that sense, the film didn't work in that particular goal.
Right, so I think the word cartoonish comes up again for me. Marc, Damien Chazelle, he is a great filmmaker, though. He's won critical acclaim and multiple Oscars for films such as Whiplash, La La Land, and First Man. So just a bump in his road in his career, I guess?
Yeah, it's interesting where he's going to go. I wasn't the biggest fan of First Man either, and that also was a film but that's a very different film in terms of like its style and its tone. I found it actually too understated. That was my big problem with that film. La La Land, I think, is interesting. I think his best film and the one he seems to dislike the most now. So I don't know, like he would probably disagree with that assessment. And it'll be interesting again where he goes from here. Again, this film wasn't a success, so I don't know how easy it's going to be for him to get this kind of big budget to make a film again. Maybe he'll go back to making something a bit smaller, like Whiplash, and see where it goes.
It's an $80 million film, the budget, and I don't think there are going to be many more films of this type, of this budget in the future. So in that sense, a lot of people are describing it as kind of like the last of its kind.
I know you briefly wanted to also mention something about the soundtrack, because you're a fan of the soundtrack at least, Darcy.
Yeah, I think the soundtrack is really kind of connecting with a wider audience. And, the composer Justin Hurwitz has worked with the director on all of his films to date, and of course La La Land has a lot of famous tunes, and this film too, it really heavily jazz influenced soundtrack that I think a lot of people will enjoy, even if they don't enjoy the movie.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, let's move on to our second film now. As we said, another international release, but a much smaller independent film from Scotland. It's called Aftersun. It has the same name in Korean as well, and it has been receiving many critical praises in the past few months. Marc, can you tell us more about this one?
Yeah, this is the feature debut of a writer-director named Charlotte Wells. And apparently, like a lot of debut films, fairly autobiographical, or at least she's delving into some of her own personal experiences. The story is about an 11-year-old Scottish girl, played by a newcomer, Frankie Corio, who goes on a holiday to Turkey with her father, and who her father is no longer living with her and her mother. They're kind of separated. And the story is also framed as a kind of something of a reminiscence. So we get like scenes with the adult Sophie. Parts of the film are framed as kind of home video memories that she takes of her camera and photos, those kind of things. And there's not a great deal of plot. It really is more about focusing on the two main characters and their relationship over this holiday that they have. And so it's kind of a melancholic, kind of nostalgic look back. It has that. It's really going for a mood or a feeling more than it is like a tightly structured plot or anything like that. The father is played by Paul Mescal, who's an Irish actor who gained acclaim through a TV series, Normal People, and is actually nominated for an Oscar for this award. And it seems like he's kind of someone who's going to be a fairly big star in the next couple of years. He's in a couple of big projects coming up. And he's quite, in both the lead performances, I think, kind of, carry the film just because so much of it is about, this relationship, right? Yeah.
Okay, so Darcy, it sounds like a wistful, nostalgic film, but one that has landed the lead and Oscar nomination. What do you think of it?
I mean, I really liked it. I'd heard a lot about the film before I saw it, so I went in with fairly high expectations, but I deliberately kind of avoided reading about the film because I didn't want to know in advance. And, it's true that there is very little plot. And if you're looking for things to develop, then, things aren't really going to develop. It's essentially a vacation and memories. And, the film, the perspective shifts back and forth. Most of it, we're seeing it through the eyes of this 11-year-old girl, but there are moments when we seem to be looking at it from more of a distance and from more of an adult perspective. We're getting this view of her father who, is dealing with some issues, but, it's not really explained in a direct way. We only get, in some ways, it's kind of filtered through her perspective as an 11-year-old who wouldn't understand these kind of things. But, with, looking back many years later, there are details that perhaps, she can understand in a different way. And that's really what the director's doing. When watching the film, I was really kind of absorbed in it and taken by it, but it's the kind of film that particularly after you leave the theater, I think it hits you the hardest. And it's when you're kind of thinking back on the film later that, there's a lot of kind of sadness in the film. Despite the fact that this vacation itself is kind of a happy memory for both of them. And so it's a really interesting mix of emotions. You don't get these really strong outbursts of emotions in the film, but it does accumulate in you, I think, as you're watching it.
Right, so it's a film that stayed with you, Darcy. Marc, what about you?
Yeah, this is my favorite film of the year.
Wow, okay.
And I've seen over 100, so it's a high praise.
You've seen over 100 this year?
Yeah, that were released in 2022, yeah. And this is number one for me. It reminds me a lot of actually another Scottish filmmaker named Lynn Ramsay, who came about in the late 90s and whose work I really admire. And at first I thought maybe I was being a bit lazy with that comparison because they're both Scottish female directors. But I have listened to now for interviews where she said, especially the end sequence of this film is right from one of Ramsay's films. And,
wow, okay.
And there is that kind of influence. And it is, it's just this kind of impressionistic kind of, like Darcy said, like as you're watching it, you're invested, but then it kind of stays with you a lot more as you go kind of out of the theater. And a lot of it's going to be what personal experiences you bring to the film too. So even though I don't have the experience of being a girl, I do have the experience of separated parents and going on vacations with my father at that age. And so I probably brought some emotions to it that maybe others wouldn't. But I think anyone can really connect to this in some way, I think, depending on, your identification with the parent, the child, both, this kind of combination. I think it's a kind of a special film. So hopefully people will see it, even though it's in this very limited release here.
Sure, wow. Your favorite film, Marc's favorite film of over the last year, you mean, right?
Of the 2022 year, yeah.
Rather 2022, rather than
it would be my best picture Oscar winner, let's put it that way.
Interesting, okay.
Not that a picture like this would ever get the Oscar. But,
sure, but still, it is quite the recommendation. Yeah. Okay, we're out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. That's our spotlight for this week. Darcy, Marc, thank you both for your time today and your thoughtful reviews, and we'll see you both again next time.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a great weekend.